The Diary of Dr. X, Episode 23. Money Talks, Honesty Walks. I actually received some good news around the time I wrote the Ditch Beer episode, which aired recently. First time in years. I was accepted as a sessional instructor to teach 2 courses, no less, at one of the local universities. One in the Environmental Studies department and one in the Philosophy department. A week later, as luck would have it, a second section of one of them was added, namely the Environmental Ethics class, bumping me up to the equivalent of a full course load for a full-time professor. As a sessional instructor, I made only about a third of what a full-time professor would have made for doing the exact same job. Nor did I get a private office, just a shared one. As is typical of the economically exploited temporary staff the universities use to fill in the gaps. So I seldom used it. Part-time or sessional teaching is the only type of academic work I've had since graduation, and my opportunities to teach have been decreasing as the years since graduation have slowly piled up. At first, my alma mater took pretty good care of me, along with a regular course at the other university in town each fall. But I lost that course when a new department head was assigned who didn't agree with my philosophy. More on that later. And there has been little else for years, even though I apply regularly. My life actually changed very little due to the employment, strangely enough. There was just less time for collecting due to my academic responsibilities. And my stress level, of course, went through the roof. It had been 2.5 years since my last teaching assignment. I hadn't taught a class since before getting stuck in that job in the bread plant from hell for 2 years and pretending I was doing academic research. And I didn't get my first paycheck until almost the end of January in the winter term, despite the fact that I began teaching at the beginning of the month. So there I was, attempting to maintain as much of my collecting schedule as possible, while also trying to spend some time on preparing lectures and doing the readings the students were expected to do while unpaid for almost a month, since of course I had to keep up on them also. And then going in 3 times a week for about 3 hours per class to pretend I was still a doctor while picking up cigarette butts and beer cans the rest of the week. What a joke. And it didn't get any better when the money started coming in either. You see, my desktop computer had finally crashed for a good 6 months before. Left me without a computer for a few months. Thankfully, my brother refurbished a laptop he had bought for my niece to use during her university instruction that needed a new hard drive, keyboard, and battery, which I received for Christmas that year. I couldn't have accepted the teaching job otherwise, in fact. But I still needed a new desktop that was current. So my first few paychecks went to buying that, with very little to spare. On layaway, of course, due to my bankruptcy to escape my student loans and other credit extended, while myself and others still assumed I would soon be making a big salary as a full-time professor. This computer right here, actually. Well, boy, were we all wrong. And the last couple paychecks, once that was paid for, when I was in the clear, well, they went to pay my rent and bills for 2 months in advance. So while I was living in poverty the entire time I was teaching, despite the decent paychecks, I even had to bum smokes off my students at break time in the lectures once in a while, since I couldn't afford enough tobacco to keep me supplied from one paycheck to the next. Thankfully, in the early January cold, just as I was going into the teaching, the beginning of the month, I had some good luck. I was doing a walk along the front streets, mostly focused on gathering up some butts as I had my beer for the night that day. When I got to the city-owned parking lot in the northwest corner of Stradbrook and Osborne, I got a nice surprise. It was a plastic bag large enough to hold about a quarter pound, but only had about a quarter ounce of shake left in the bottom. Marijuana, obviously. It was just lying there on the pavement. Can't imagine why someone left it, unless they felt they were about to be checked by the cops and tossed it out the window as they turned into the lot, followed by them, or whatever. But who cares? It's mine now, right? That made it easier to cope while I had less time for gathering to pay for supplies for almost 2 months. Yeah, I had a little less for beer, but I had joints to take up the slack now. Sweet! As for the teaching itself, well, I'd have to say that the 2 sections of environmental ethics were the biggest joy of my teaching career. You see, I signed my own books, along with a text containing various readings in the area as texts. Not only did I get extra cash from selling my students my own books, I also used them as my lecture notes for most of the class. It's almost certainly the only time I will ever have the opportunity to teach my own philosophy and how I derived it live and in person to a classroom or 2 of living students at this point. As for the business and environment class, on the other hand, it taught me the lesson which gives this chapter its title. You see, in this case, I was assigned readings to teach by the person who had designed the class. I went into his office to meet with him and discuss what was required prior to the session. He told me he had consulted with another professor at a university in Ontario on the reading list when asked by the department to put the course together. Well, all I can tell you is this. As I did my students in the last lecture, had it not been for myself adding in readings for my own writings, there would have been no mention anywhere, in a class on business and environment, mind you, of the green philosophical literature. You see, there is an entire literature out there written by sellouts who are telling the world what it wants to hear rather than what it needs to hear. Namely, that you can be green and sustainable while still pursuing the goals of the CCCP planners, such as economic growth and expansion. If they had any knowledge of the green literature, they would clearly know that the concept of sustainability was proposed as an alternative to economic growth as a guide for social planning. In other words, you can't have both at the same time. Yet this literature steals the concept, along with the concept of ecological efficiency, without any reference whatever to the green literature from which it came. If my students did the same in a paper they submitted, I would give them an F for plagiarism. In other words, failing to acknowledge the source of your ideas and claiming them as your own. Too bad you can't do the same to your colleagues after they've already published their ridiculous ideas in print. But, you see, there is a huge market for the kind of BS that the environmentalists are selling, you see. All the corporations want to hear it. There are plenty of research grants to be had, lots of funding, as long as you are willing to toe the CCCP line. So who do you think controls the academy? Keeping in mind that those already in the system are responsible for doing the hiring. The environmentalists. The ones who tell the world what it wants to hear and get paid handsomely for it, rather than the ecologists like me who tell the world what it needs to hear. That's who. Sure, they will hire me to teach a temporary course to fill in a gap, but do you think they want to hire someone who will tell their students that what they are teaching them is full of crap? Not likely. You see, money talks, even in the academy. Unfortunately, in this case, honesty walks. In my case, walks the streets of the Osborne village looking for beer cans and cigarette butts rather than teaching a course in the academy as a full-time professor. And why? Because there is no market for the truth.